So I want to start by saying good evening and welcome. I am thrilled that you decided to join us on a Friday evening in what I believe is going to be a very powerful panel discussion. If you attended our previous discussion on a culturally responsive PUSD, thank you for coming back for more. The poll, the brief consists of questions that should be easy for you to answer if you were with us previously. So if this is your first time, I thank you for being here as well. And I just want you to be ready for a robust discussion that will get us all thinking about the urgent need for transformation of public education. The conversation introduced the community. At our last meeting, the conversation introduced the community to the concept of PUSD with the support of our community stakeholders, becoming a culturally responsive school district. Tonight's discussion will take a deeper dive into the relatedness of cultural responsiveness and DEI. We may include the role of critical race theory as well, because we can get pretty deep. Your role as our special guest is to keep an open mind, be respectful, and chime in at the appropriate time with your questions and comments that promote deeper insight and a clearer understanding of the issues at hand. Now, before I introduce our panelists, I want to make sure you're aware of a few housekeeping rules. First, the chat will remain closed until the Q&A. We will also be in control of your mics, and this is done as a courtesy for all in attendance. During the Q&A, you will be able to post questions in the chat. However, if you would like to ask questions verbally, if you would like to ask your question verbally, we just ask that you request for your mic to be unmuted, and we'll take care of that for you. Okay. With that, I'll tell you a little bit about our panelists. I first would like to introduce Dr. Brian McDonald. Dr. Brian McDonald is Superintendent of the Pasadena Unified School District. As the Chief Executive Officer of a district with more than 14,000 students serving the community of Altadena, Pasadena, and Sierra Madre, he brings expertise as a classroom teacher, school principal, and central office administrator to his leadership in the district. As superintendent, Dr. McDonald is committed to transforming PUSD into one of the top public school districts in the region. To achieve this, he is engaged in strategic planning efforts in partnership with the Board of Education to guide the district in making organizational changes while repositioning resources to improve outcomes for all students. A fluent Spanish speaker, Dr. McDonald has a Bachelor of Science degree in accounting from the University of Houston, downtown Texas, and a master's in education administration from Texas Southern University. He earned a certification in principalship from Harvard Graduate School in 2002 and a doctorate in educational leadership from the Sam Houston State University in 2010. Dr. McDonald and his family live in Pasadena, California. Our next panelist will be Jouslynn Griffin. Jouslynn Griffin is a passionate racial equity advocate, and I know this firsthand. She holds a master's degree in business administration. She's certified through the University South Florida School of Business as a DEI in the workplace facilitator and is a human resources professional with 15 years of public and private HR experiences. Through her HR consulting firm, she conducts workshops that seamlessly blend popular culture, scholarly sources, and personal experiences to have safe and brave conversations about race that are impactful, educational, and humorous. Her straightforward approach is honest, raw, and suitable in this time of racial equity and social justice awareness. Jouslynn believes in the dynamic work of racial reconciliation and the anti-racist movement. She believes sharing authentic stories and talking about real issues is the key to healing from the trauma that is racism. She is active in her community as a Victory Bible Church member and a Girl Scout troop leader. Jouslynn serves as a board member to the Convalescent Aid Society, the Pasadena branch of the NAACP, and is the chairwoman of Women in the NAACP WIN committee. Jouslynn is a mother of 3 and lives in Pasadena, California. Then you will hear from Dr. Allison Steps. She is a product of Pasadena Unified School District, having attended Audubon Elementary, Altadena Elementary, Elliott Middle School, and Blair High School. After attending college, Dr. Steps returned to her hometown and started working at Elliott Middle School. She has also worked at Marshall Secondary, Blair, and Pasadena High Schools. As a product of the public educational system and then working within the system, Dr. Steps has continuously sought to make positive change to inequities through her work as a counselor. Currently, Dr. Steps serves as the president of United Teachers of Pasadena and is helping guide the work for diversity, equity, and inclusion in collaboration with other stakeholders in PUSD. Dr. Mack Hines. Dr. Mack Hines III is one of the nation's leading advocates for racial justice and equity in the field of education. He is widely regarded for his strategies for transforming schools in culturally responsive, anti-racist ways. His work has replicated in educational organizations within the United States. So next up, you will hear from Dr. Brian McDonald, who will talk about the resolutions that the board approved last year, resolutions 2566 and 2586, the district's commitment to Black and Latinx students respectfully, using them as a framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Bailey, and thank you everyone for being here today. This conversation tonight is an important one in that students of color, and especially those living in poverty, are not having the same kinds of measurable success like other student groups. So this therefore begs the question as to why, after so many years of school reform, we have only seen incremental improvement. And I think that one part of this very complex issue is the way the system was designed. So the system wasn't necessarily designed for students of color or even modern day students for that matter. Thomas Jefferson is widely quoted as saying, in proposing a design for the educational system in the Commonwealth of Virginia, somewhere around 1785, he's widely, and I'll paraphrase, he's widely quoted as saying that we will rake 20 geniuses from the rubbish annually to be educated at the public's expense. So I think that illustrates my point that the system wasn't necessarily designed for students of color. And as a result, to this day, we see significant issues with how students of color perform academically and social emotionally as well. Now, there are myriad ways to ensure that students of color are given the support that they need to be successful as an overall group. But more than anything, they need to feel valued, respected, and a part of something special. Now, the research is very clear that students of color should see themselves in the curriculum, as it has been proven that it makes the lessons far more meaningful and relevant for them. And then, of course, the instructional techniques that are used by teachers should also be aligned with how best they learn. So when you pair the deliberate attempts to value the rich diversity that we have in society and in our schools, and make sure that making sure that students have everything that they need when they need it, and we also make every effort to ensure that they are included and can bring their full selves to school, then we will start to see movement in terms of their academic performance. So my specific task this evening is to speak briefly about the two resolutions that were passed not too long ago by the Board of Education, resolutions 2566 and 2586. Commitment to Black students and commitment to Latin students. So while we have done significant work in the area of culturally responsiveness and diversity, equity and education over the years, we still have a ways to go to embed this work in the culture of our district. And I really want to thank Board Member Bailey for championing these two resolutions that serve as a framework for our district. They provide clear direction from the board, and quite frankly serves as a call to action that the district can rally around. And it allows our school sites, and it allows us to address the 3 C's. First, it gives us comfort in knowing that there is support at the top, because this is something that the board approved and that they are championing as well. And the second C is confidence. The resolutions give us confidence in just simply getting the work done. We know the board has our back. We know upper management is supportive of the effort. So we can go full steam ahead and just simply get the work done. And the third C is competence, in the sense that there are deliberate steps in educating and equipping staff that we're working through the process of delivering to our teammates all across the district. And you will hear more about this from Dr. Steps a little later on. The resolutions also serve as something that we can keep coming back to as a way to remind ourselves of what we say we're going to do and how to do it. And also, again, the resolutions show that we're serious about this work. It gives us something to anchor our efforts to. So I want to again thank Board Member Bailey for leading the way on this and for her tireless efforts on behalf of kids. And so again, I want to thank you all for being here, and you will be hearing from some experts tonight who will bring clarity to our efforts and speak to why this work is truly of utmost importance. So thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. McDonald. Really excited to learn more about the 3 C's. And thank you so much, Board Member Bailey. And I really want to appreciate the time that we're spending on this very important topic. I'm genuinely passionate about DEI. My catchphrase is DEI is my love language. So I'm excited to be here tonight. As mentioned in my bio, I am a human resources professional, and my expertise and experience is in staffing public agencies, including PUSD classified staff for 7 years. So my focus will be to point to the business case for DEI. Okay, and one more thing that was not mentioned in my bio, very important. Come with me now. Go Bulldogs. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get to business. Can you all imagine if each individual person had the specific tools and resources they needed to succeed in our community? Think about it, a place where everyone can be who they are no matter where they are. Well, that's pretty much the purpose of DEI and inclusion plans. DEI is a business strategy that in the future will be used to attract and retain employees, and hopefully the best employees. If DEI starts as a business strategy, it becomes embedded in the workplace culture and then reaches customers, stakeholders, and our community, allowing all to show up as their unassimilated, authentic selves. With a heightened focus on racial equity and inclusion conversations, organizations of all sizes are working to ensure their organizational cultures and standard operating practices have a DEI focus. But DEI training is not a new trend. We can journey to January 1863. Yes, the Emancipation Proclamation for a deep understanding. DEI is all rooted in the rights and fair treatment of employees and the relationships with their employers. Some additional history you can examine is the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery, free labor. In the era of Reconstruction, we can look at the practice of sharecropping and how those systems exploited formerly enslaved people. Black codes were laws designed to control how former enslaved people engaged in gainful employment and earned wages. We can look at the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Industrial Revolution in the 40s. Do you all remember the iconic Rosie the Riveter campaign? We can do it. That sounds familiar, right? Well, that campaign serves as a symbol for women in the workforce and for women's independence, which can also be used to link the origins of DEI. In addition to this history, many presidential executive orders and federal and local laws have shaped the way businesses and educational institutions address DEI, fair hiring, and admissions. I have a little more history for you, and there's a lot. I'm not covering it all, just trying to get to some of the meat of it. Executive Order 9981 was enacted in 1848 by President Truman, which officially desegregated the armed forces. In 1961, President Kennedy's Executive Order 10925 instructed federal contractors to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are treated equally without regard to race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. A few years later, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was created. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made discrimination in the workplace illegal for any business, public or private, to use discriminatory hiring and firing practices. And there's more. President Nixon's 1790 Executive Order number 4 authorized flexible goals and timetables to correct the underutilization of minorities by federal contractors. Executive Order number 4 was later revised to include women, which was right around the time married women began to enter the workforce in high numbers. Finally, I'll go over 1793, the Rehabilitation Act was passed, and that was the first time, 1973, and that was the first time in history the civil rights of people with disabilities were protected by law. The Equal Justice Initiative captions many of their social media posts with the following quote: "To overcome racial inequality, we must confront our history." Well, I add to that, to truly understand DEI, we have to address how BIPOC, women, and how people with disabilities have been treated in the workplace. After the Civil Rights Act, diversity education became standard for many organizations, military sectors, and higher education institutions. Diversity training became widespread in the late 80s and continued throughout the 90s to protect against and settle civil rights suits. However, the popularity started to decrease in the mid-90s when affirmative action became banned in about 10 states, including California in 96 and Idaho in 2020. Some equity advocates argue that the current climate of DEI initiatives have moved away from their original intent, and maybe they did, but DEI makes space for us to include all groups. So hopefully, for example, month of June, we're celebrating Pride Month, but we should acknowledge that this celebration has roots connected to the civil rights movement. Remember when President Obama signed Executive Order number 2014, adding sexual orientation and gender identity protections for all federal employees. All marginalized groups and people feel as though we want to feel as though we are welcomed into organizations, businesses, and educational institutions. And the desire for us to receive equitable treatment is still present and must be addressed. So DEI training should be race explicit, but not race exclusive. Again, DEI training should be race explicit, but not race exclusive. I've covered a lot of history, and part of my DEI facilitation includes setting up safe and brave spaces. That allows with making everyone feel comfortable in sharing their stories, and it also helps in developing shared language and definitions of terms, which is a great way to DEI initiative. Doing so allows participants to have courageous conversations and to focus on the work that needs to be done, as opposed to arguing as to what it is we're talking about and wasting time on that. I point to a popular term, intersectionality, coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in the 80s, which is simply a prism to see the interactive effects of various forms of discrimination and disempowerment. Through intersectionality, we can begin to explore how Pride Month and race means different things to different people. For example, a queer Black man may experience diversity and equity different than a gay white male. And those are the intersections that we have to begin to address in DEI. For this conversation, it's essential to know that in general, diversity is the act of creating safe spaces for various people and groups. Thus, we can consider race, gender, we can consider age, sexual orientation, culture, language, diversity in thoughts, physical abilities, and even neurodisabilities when we're addressing diversity. Equity ensures that those same groups and people have fair opportunity, treatment, and access to the tools and resources they need to succeed and advance. Including and centering underrepresented people and groups whose voices have been silenced in the decision-making processes is how inclusion works. And using their ideas and crediting them for their contribution may even be considered mastery. Accessibility is the design of products, devices, services, or environments to be usable by people with disabilities. Providing a safe and brave space for everyone to feel as though they can show up as their true and authentic selves is the best way to foster belonging. When I consult with business owners, I often get asked, how do we start this program? And my answer is simple. Just start. Know that there will be growing pains. You will not always get it right, but be open to hearing correction from rank and file staff and from your customers along the way. As leaders, we really must go through the unlearning and relearning process. And I advise that DEI requires individual and organizational commitment. On an individual level, commitment to learning about cultural humility, developing cross-cultural skills, and learning from people whose voices have been historically silenced. That's inclusion, and it's the core of DEI work. On an organizational level, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives should transform operational practices in every area of the organization. So when we're planning to include DEI, we should not start developing a plan with employees or the stakeholders if we've not developed and internalized a plan for our board members and our executive leadership teams. We need our boards, employees, community leaders, and our allies to embrace inclusivity and equity through a robust organizational exploratory process, transitioning to policymaking, and then we will experience the culture shift. Additionally, the DEI initiative must be linked to the strategic planning process. Thank you so much for pointing that out, Dr. McDonald. I can guarantee you this journey to a truly inclusive organization and community will be uncomfortable for some. And that's why we have to start on the individual level. And I like to call that the heart work. The goal is to review each business area through a DEI lens and ask, who are we excluding in this message, policy, or proposed change? What stereotypes or microaggressions are we perpetuating? This is when inclusion comes in and when we have to center those underrepresented voices. If not, in our current roles, we will continue to make the same errors and omissions. Asking how will marginalized group be impacted is key. We can try to figure this out on our own, saying that we know what they think, or I have a cousin who's in that group. But really, we have to get the folks in the room to learn from them. Y'all know Shirley Chisholm is quoted by saying, if you're not invited to the table, just bring a folding chair. We've got to move beyond that mindset. Open up the rooms and the tables. Stop talking at these people and start working and talking with them. Some areas to be considered in your DEI planning phase. First, are we hiring and retaining talent who subscribe to DEI principles? We should analyze the vendors and contractors that we're working with. Is it possible to work with vendors who also subscribe to DEI principles? How can we collaborate with community partners on this initiative? And finally, we must design a sustainable business model to ensure DEI is embedded in every function of the organization's vision, mission, and core values. We cannot do authentic DEI work if our leadership and DEI team has not embodied the tenets of DEI. Being steadfast in an initiative of this magnitude will take commitment and dedication, and it will not happen overnight. But statistics on diversity predict it will be well worth the time and effort in the end. And there's also a business case for DEI. By 2025, millennials are predicted to make up 75% of the workforce. That's just a few years away. So when companies foster a more inclusive work environment, it's said that 83% of those millennials are found to be actively engaged in their work. In a recent Monster survey, 83% of Gen Z candidates said that a company's commitment to diversity and inclusion is important when choosing an employer. So a DEI plan will be a tool to attract and retain the largest population of the workforce in the near future. Lastly, by 2044, groups formerly seen as minorities will reach majority status. The workplace will look different. Our communities will look different. And we have to begin making space for these changes and to recruit and hire the best employees to lead our schools and other organizations. So the message to the community should be, these issues matter, and we need partners to come along with us on this journey. DEI can no longer be considered a nice to have. We need to make it a business necessity. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet to developing a successful DEI plan. The goal, leave no one behind, no group or person. We need to have a charge that understanding that DEI starts with you. It starts on the individual level. Develop your action plan to bring the journey of developing cultural humility, then competency, and ultimately cultural proficiency. Board Member Bailey, thank you so much for inviting me into this space. It's very important that whenever you're doing the work of DEI, you start with fostering a safe and brave space. And to all of the facilitators and leaders out there, be sure to practice self-care when you're doing this work. Thank you so much. I look forward to Dr. Mack Hines.
Thank you, Ms. Griffin. It's Dr. Steps up next. No, it's okay. Go Blair, go Vikings. Anyway, I worked at THS for a while. It is nice to be here this evening, and it is awesome to see so many familiar faces from town. Growing up in Pasadena Unified and actually working in Pasadena Unified, I've experienced a few things that have pushed me to have this conversation on a larger scale and to see if we can't make some changes within our district. Like Jouslynn was saying, it is important for us to have an environment where everyone feels safe, all stakeholders, whether that be our students, our employees, or everyone needs to be able to bring their whole self to work. So over the past year, we've been doing some work for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that work has led us to a mission statement and some definitions, and to look at bringing a lens to Pasadena Unified School District that recognizes that we do need to make sure we're including all individuals in our work and point out our students of color and our employees of color. So to that, our mission statement was to provide a safe and supportive environment where we work to eradicate let me start again, I apologize. So our mission, to provide a safe and supportive environment where we work to eradicate systemic inequalities, including, but not limited to, racism, microaggressions, and unconscious biases used in a derogatory manner toward Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC for short, in our entire school system, so all employees, students, and families can grow and thrive in our journey toward diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, as an employee in Pasadena Unified, and even as a student, I have experienced different things that stick with me. They can be traumatic when you're 13 years old and you're told that a decision about where you will be educated is based on your race. With Pasadena Unified being federally mandated to desegregate their schools through the busing system, I was a product of that. And to remember that experience years later, decades later, is traumatic for a child. And there are some things that need to be rectified within our school district. So when we were doing our work as a committee, we chose to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, but not to use your Webster's dictionary definition, rather to create a definition that was important to us, that stated what we wanted it to state. And so when we talk about diversity, we say that we want to, the definition would be intentionally valuing the multiple identities that are represented in our school structure. So when Jouslynn mentioned that you may have a student, a Black male that may also be gay, he may experience things different than a white male who is gay. But we need to be able to value that student's identity regardless of anything that they, any of their other attributes, right? No one should be put down for anything. No one should feel less than. We need to be able to live, schools are a microcosm of society, so we need to be able to accept everyone for who they are, not only accept people for who they are, but value them, learn from one another. And we need to do that within our school structure. when we talk about equity, our definition was equity is ensuring avenues of success for all students and staff by honoring and supporting individual experiences, talents, skills, and needs. Jouslynn mentioned American Disabilities Act. Dr. McDonald mentioned students with, sometimes we need to reallocate resources and things of the sort. We need to honor our students, honor our staff, honor their successes. And it's not that we're trying to, a colleague of mine used the image of everybody looking over a fence, and you're trying to, you have different steps for each person, I'm sure, and somebody else may be taller, and saying that that's equity, but equity isn't necessarily that. We need to really be able to, we really need to be able to honor each thing about each individual person and allow them to bring their whole selves to work or to school. It just depends on whether you're a student or staff. When we talked about inclusion, inclusion was a space where a person's whole identity is appreciated, celebrated, and supported, and all experiences and contributions are valued. And so while they all kind of go within one another, we do need to look at them all as definitions to help us actively fight oppression and inequities within our school structure. So school is a systemic structure that was developed years ago and wasn't necessarily developed for everyone to succeed. Acknowledging that, we need to make some changes. We need to be able to look at the curriculum that we put in front of our students and make sure that we're not putting inaccuracies in front of our students and telling them that that's the truth. So when we talk about a textbook, that a history textbook that says that slavery was a choice or that slavery was immigration, we need to say that that is not an adequate textbook that should be put in front of our students. We need to be able to look at all of those things. Additionally, looking at hiring practices and making sure that people who cannot value students, who cannot value one another as colleagues, that there's a reprogramming of sorts. That there's a whole diversity, equity, and inclusion within our human resources so that we have an opportunity to work with professional development and everything else, to work with everyone in recognizing what their individual biases are. I know that I have my own. When it comes up and I'm meeting with someone and I recognize that that's one of my things, I recognize that and I need to recalibrate. That's what we need to do if we're going to be able to educate students, work with one another. We have to be able to recognize where we lack and where we need to gain some more experiences. It's not just about reading books. We need to have those courageous conversations with one another. It's not fear just because of different stereotypes that are perpetuated. We can't continue to live that way. We must accept individuals for who they are and learn how to work with one another, learn how to educate our students in order to create a society or a Pasadena community in which we can thrive, grow, and have young people that can be extremely proud of an education that they've earned because it values them as individuals. So thank you, Board Member Bailey, for having this tonight, and I will pass it on to Dr. Mack. But Dr. Hines, could you please turn on your mic?
Okay, my apologies. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Board Member Bailey. I would like to thank you so much for this opportunity to be here tonight to speak to this august audience about the work that we're doing in the great Pasadena Unified School District. Another reason why I'm really excited to be here is because of the words of the late, great Frederick Douglass, that it's easier to build stronger children than it is to repair broken men. I think one of the most important ways that we can build the type of children we want to see to be successful is definitely through diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the other building block, in my opinion, is cultural responsiveness. So what I want to do is take a few seconds, if I can, and give you a little bit of information about this powerful term. All right, here we go. All right, here we go. Cultural responsiveness. Research says that cultural responsiveness is the competency in having an awareness of one's own cultural identity and views about difference, and the ability to learn and build on the varying cultural and community norms of students and their families. The National Center for the Cultural Responsiveness in the Educational System says that cultural responsiveness is the ability to learn from and relate respectfully with people of your own culture as well as those from other cultures. Now, as that marinate, I want to show you another slide. Take a few minutes, because to me, cultural responsiveness is here. It is all about the kids. It is all about understanding where our kids come from and who our kids are and how to connect with them. On the surface, you see race, you see gender. Below the surface, you see socioeconomic status, you see family structure, you see class, but most importantly, you see children who bring unique differences to the table, and those differences must be honored and valued in a way that allows them to be successful. So to me, cultural responsiveness, ladies and gentlemen, is diversity, equity, and inclusion in constant and continual practice for the benefits of our children. Now, I could provide you with tons of research that talks about how we must go about being culturally responsive to children. But what I will do is basically give you 3 themes that I've found to be very, very, very effective in ensuring that every child that walks in a school building has the opportunity and has the access for their different identities to be honored and valued in culturally unique and relevant ways. And for me, it is what I call a solid ground approach. It is background, it is common ground, it is higher ground. I'll say it again. It is background, it is common ground, and it is higher ground. Background is simple. You can't lead where you don't go, and you cannot teach who you do not know. So it is very important for us as educators, for us as community leaders, to advocate for really taking the opportunity to know who our children are, to know where our children are coming from, because once we know who our children really are, we're in a position to be able to provide them with the knowledge, the skills, and the disposition that matters and connect with their lived experiences. And this will allow them to go beyond school to really become productive citizens in our society. Another aspect of background is knowing who we are, as Dr. Stepp so eloquently stated a few minutes ago. It is important that we get in touch with ourselves. Who are we racially? Who are we from a socioeconomic standpoint? Who are we from a gender standpoint? Who are we from our multiple identities? Because the more we understand who we are, the more we can understand what influences and shapes how we interact with students. My pastor always says, what you think when you see another person says more about you than it does the other person. And this is so true, because what you think when you see people who are different from you, it is a derivative of how you have been socialized, how you have been brought up to think about difference, how you've been thought up to think about people who don't look like you, who don't talk like you, who don't think like you, who don't sound like you, and who are unfamiliar to you. So it is important for us to really take the time when we're interacting with God's precious children to really take into consideration our backgrounds and their backgrounds as well. Next, common ground. It is vitally important for us to, yes, understand who we are and where our children are coming from, but it is equally important, ladies and gentlemen, if we're going to really be culturally responsive in the name of diversity, equity, inclusion, to really take what we know and establish common ground. The key word is common. To me, that simply means that we're setting fertile ground to connect with our children in ways that matter to them, that we're taking who they are not only into consideration, but we're using that as a form of elevation to really connect with them and put them in a place to where they can really thrive and soar and be successful in and beyond our school settings. Next, last but not least, is higher ground. It is very important for us to establish relationships with our children, but it is equally important to use those relationships in very intentional and very purposeful ways to take students to where they want to go. Education is about elevating kids to the next level. It is about motivating, it is about educating, it is about elevating them and helping them to go to a place where they may not know. The late great Earl Nightingale says that when you look at a kid or you look at a person and what you see, it does not have a lot to do with them, first off. It has more to do than what you believe that they can do. And my question to all of us in tonight's audience is, when we see our kids, what do we see? What do we think? Do we see them in a place of higher ground, or do we see them in a place of being grounded only in how far we think they can go? What do we feel about what our children can do today? Are we in the business of teaching kids, or are we in the business of also schooling them in ways to where they can become well-informed and well-intentioned adults as they aspire to be community leaders as well? Higher ground is so important because higher ground is where we see students have their aha moments, realizing that the purpose of education, the purpose of teaching and learning is for them to grow and soar and flow and to be in places that they never thought they could be. That starts with what we plant in their heads in the classroom and in the community as well. And this is the type of higher ground that every child, regardless of, when we rephrase that, with regard to their racial background, with regard to their gender background, with regard to their socioeconomic background, they've got to know that when they come in PUSD or any other school district in America, that they can achieve higher ground. So for me, culture responsiveness in action is when you can use diversity, equity, and inclusive in ways to really establish a background for children, establish common ground with them, and then take them to higher ground. And that, to me, is what I mean when I say culture responsiveness. I think my colleagues before me, with the resolution, with the business and the academic perspective of diversity, equity, and inclusion, have really laid the foundation for my talk on culture responsiveness. And I'll leave you with this one other thought. James Baldwin says that not everything that we face can be changed, but nothing, and I mean nothing, can be changed until we face it. We've got to face the fact that kids are different from us, but those differences are not deficits, they're assets, and we must invest in those assets to produce the type of children that we know that they can be. Thank you. I'd leave it over to the keynote speaker.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you all. Before the keynote speaker, I'd like to introduce him. He has the task of tying it all together for us. And I don't doubt that he's not going to make it work. So I want to introduce to you and present to some of you who already know, Dr. Jerell Hill. He's our keynote speaker for this evening. He is the Dean and Assessment Coordinator in the School of Education at Pacific Oaks College. He's a dynamic scholar practitioner, being a voice for educational justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. His current research includes teacher preparation and academic achievement. Additional areas of research include adverse childhood experience, student motivation, educational administration, special education, and urban schools. Dr. Hill has over 20 years of service as an educator. He is proud to have taught within many diverse populations and in a range of urban educational contexts, including special education, middle school, high school, undergraduate, graduate, and educational development and employment training programs. Additionally, he became a principal, district administrator, and assistant superintendent before working in higher education. Dr. Hill has been a keynote speaker, published peer-reviewed articles, developed a curriculum for the Adult Education Workforce Program, and has led an academic mission for graduate students internationally. His professional memberships include the American Educational Research Association, California Association of African American Superintendents and Administrators, International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, co-chair of the Diversity and Cultural Competence Committee there, and the CEC, Council of Exceptional Children. I now present Dr. Jerell Hill. Take it.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I probably shouldn't, I will start with my high school because I saw Blair and PHS, so I will have to recognize my Bulldog heritage and being home in Pasadena. So thank you again for all the keynotes that really, all the speakers and panelists that kind of set the tone for what we're going to discuss tonight. I'm going to share my screen and kind of walk you guys through what we're going to do here is really walk you through the invitation that we like to talk about at Pacific Oaks. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's not sufficient to be a non-biased, also highly unlikely, nor is it sufficient to be an observer. It is necessary for each individual to actively intervene, to challenge and counter the personal and institutional behaviors that perpetuate oppression. Before we really get deep into it, you really have to situate it within the proper context. We know that there's historical challenges with DEI and cultural responsiveness, socioeconomic and political challenges. So your positionality really will determine how you're going to strategically engage in this process. So ideally, when you connect DEI and cultural responsiveness, you're finding a way to actively engage the system to see what works from your positionality. Dr. Hines did a great job explaining the cultural responsiveness, but I'll touch a little bit on diversity. I believe diversity, we can't use diversity as a descriptor, meaning that we're just counting people based on their ethnic or racial identity. We actually have to have them count. When we look at equity, we want to make sure that their voices are heard. So when we go to inclusion, their outcomes count. I think in the educational system, we've seen two things happen. We really need to go back to see Maslow before we go into Bloom. And initially on the left, that is the original hierarchy. But over my time in education, I've seen a shift. It looks like we have catapulted belonging up closer to self-actualization. But initially, kids have to achieve to belong instead of belonging to achieve. And what I mean by that is sometimes students are ostracized in environments because they don't hit certain marks or they don't have certain academic makeup, in a sense, in order to fit in learning environments. So Gloria Ladson-Billings, which most of you are familiar with, is the architect of culturally responsive teaching. And she really does go into 3 points. The first point is identifying academic achievement. The second is your cultural competence. The third marker is probably the most difficult. And she reminds us that we need to look at our critical consciousness or social political makeup to really talk about the current issues that matter, because sometimes our perceptions are reality. So when you look at situating culturally responsive teaching in those 3 domains, they all have to be adequately hit to actually do culturally responsive teaching. This is something I'm working on with a couple of my colleagues at Pacific Oaks. There's a lot of research out there that says that educators don't feel equipped to really talk about critical race discussions. So how do you really pivot the pedagogy? So what I've done here, and there's plenty more there, I can go on with Goldie Muhammad, the pedagogy of joy. I can go on with, Paulo Freire that talks about the pedagogy of the oppressed or hope. But when you look at the reality pedagogy with Chris Edom, that's really where you can really hit some of those critical areas around race and your positive self-identity. Culturally sustaining pedagogy from Django Paris, which is really the second level of culturally relevant pedagogy from Dr. Latson-Billings. And then again at Pacific Oaks, we're really grounded in the anti-bias pedagogy from Louise Thurman Sparks. And also we're really lucky to have Cheryl Greer-Jarman, who's one of the other architects of that specific work too. Here's something here where we have to really be mindful of, there's no hierarchy of oppression, and Audre Lorde really said that really well. There is an equation there. Inequality plus time does not equal justice. So when we look at that behavior, we know Kurt Lewins's work in 1936 was behavior is a function of the person and the environment. And if the behavior changes and the environment changes, that person has the potential to change. But really we have to go down to the very bottom of the triangle. Intention or determining tendency is what really matters most, because something has to move us towards actions. And it reminds me of what Dr. King said, that we are, as a society, we are rich in creeds, but we're anemic in deeds. So meaning that we have these sayings and we can express it, but we really haven't gotten to the point of addressing the current issues that matter. Cultural responsiveness in schools, I really like the top quote. Students experiencing racism can't wait for schools to move at their own pace and comfort level. At some point, we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And really I think Dr. Hines talked about valuing the assets and abilities and the cultures of the students when they come into the learning environment. The other piece is really engaging in critical self-reflection to really address your own bias. When you look at your self-awareness, creating that internalizing dialogue where ideally DEI and cultural responsiveness is situated in a democratic society, because I'm giving DEI as the frame, and now we're starting to use cultural responsiveness as the name. So when we can frame it and name it, now we really can point out where some of the problems are and really engage in what I like to refer to as collaborative problem solving. Here's something that changed. I really like this quote: change doesn't look for a resting place, just the next launching point. Change is only a waste of time to those who don't learn from it. So when we really look at change, it really does depend on everyone. It really is a collaborative effort to really engage in a change process. I like this photo, history as a possibility. For those that know Tommy Smith and John Carlos, this was a really interesting moment when they were doing intersectionality, because they actually had to choose their racial identity over American patriotism. And this really sparked a revolution. It was ironic that it was in Mexico City, so I can imagine what that meant to the scholars down in Mexico. This really started the work of Derek Bell, who's one of the architects of the critical legal studies, which is known as critical race theory. And I like this quote here: resistance is a powerful motivator, precisely because it enables us to feel our longing to achieve our goals, while letting us boldly recognize and name the obstacles to those achievements. So their competitive achievement here really was able to speak to that. When they were able to arise, I think Dr. Hines said higher ground, they were able to get to higher ground to really get to this possibility. So I thought that was great, as Derek Bell was one of the architects of the critical race movement. In fact, there were 35 legal scholars, and just to name a few: Kimberly Crenshaw, Neil Gatana, and Stephanie Phillips. They organized a collaborative here in an LA area law school to really break down critical legal studies, but critical race theory. So, and this is kind of the background of what critical race theory is. It holds that race has a permanently embedded aspect of American society. I like how Dr. Cornel West reminds us that it attempts to reinterpret and remake the world to reveal silent suffering and to relieve social misery. And I think that really embraces that whole idea. At the very bottom, I think we're in a space now where we really have to acknowledge people and say their names. Robert Covers, a judge who Dr. West said he was one of the legal scholars in the wilderness. And then A. Leon Hickenbottom Jr., a historian, who really were some of the founding architects of the movement. Here are some of the counter arguments. Why are we just focusing on race? What about gender? Why not class? Are we abandoning multicultural perspectives? So again, those counter arguments, also lead into stereotype threat, because as we saw Tommy Smith and John Carlos's competitive achievement, stereotype threat makes you, in what J. Luke Wood and Frank Harris would say, race light. You start to engage in this race lighting where you start to compromise your own beliefs about your own identification within your own racial group, really compromising your identity. So when you go into the critical change narrative, I like this part of countering the narrative, because stories are really important, because if we don't have counter narratives, there's one narrative that is considered a universal good. But I love this African proverb that talks about, until the lions have their historians, the tale of the hunt shall always glorify the hunter. So that counter story really does help us see the other side of what some of the realities are. Here are some of the tenets of critical race theory. Racism is normal in American society. We've seen the law have some unequal distribution of resources, but also we've seen it do some racialized power structures within the law. The interest convergence really reminds me of what I would invite educators to read, The Lost Education of Horace Tate. He talks about a one-way integration during the Brown versus Board of Education, to where the integration was one way, where the families of color had to integrate, but the white families didn't come into Black communities. So this interest convergence is really in positionality to dominant culture. We know race is a social construct, but there are some impacts. And then we talk about intersectionality, where not only Kimberly Crenshaw is a part of the critical race theory, she's also the pioneer of the intersectionality. And then the last tenet is voice and counter narrative. So this is kind of what that would look like when you talk about intersectionality. It looks a little messy and it's difficult, but at the center of it is policy, because remember, critical race came out of critical legal studies. So when you look at policy and position to social norms in our social contract, it will be kind of at the center of what we do. So naming your own reality is another important part of the work. And again, I like what Dr. Latsing-Billings and Dr. Tate said here. Really looking at stories provide members of the outgroups as a vehicle for their self-preservation, right? Much of reality is socially constructed, because how I see the world may be different. The interesting thing about listening to other people's truths, you see strings of your own life that's embedded in theirs. I know a lot of folks talked about disabilities. I see that, DEI working, because you start to see families who have students who have learning disabilities or learning differences tend to really advocate for fairness as justice, right? Because their reality is totally different than a typically developing peer. So again, ideally, this is what we do when we engage in collaborative problem solving, when you can situate DEI and cultural responsiveness in a democratic society. You perform your research, identify what works, implement what works, and then improve your outcomes. So this is really the goal, I would think, in terms of a systematic approach to really resolving some of the critical issues that matter. What is intersectionality? Here's a great definition, and I won't read this verbatim, by Kimberly Crenshaw, but she really does talk about how these intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, class, sexuality, disability, and ability really impact specific individuals, specifically people of color. Here's kind of a simplified version. Inequities are never the result of a single distinct factors. Rather, they are outcomes of intersections of different social locations, power relations, and experiences. If there is no name for a problem, we can't see the problem. So a lot of times in her work, again, I just want to remember people who were some of the hidden heroes. Emma DeGraffenreid was actually the case that sparked Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw to really look at intersectionality. She was suing General Motors because of discrimination. She was uniquely positioned because the court didn't want to hear the case, because at the time they didn't really want to weigh in on discrimination. But her situation was that the people, the men of color that worked, were in the production end and the labor end. The office workers were the white women. So the intersectionality occurred when she was a woman and then also a Black female. She was Black. So the intersectionality of her race and gender prohibited her from getting employment. So some of these events, big things happen in small spaces that really sparked a revolution. This is, again, from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. This is her graphic that talks about intersectionality in the areas that it really exists that are kind of amplified: classism, homophobia, heterosexism, xenophobia, ableism, racism, sexism. So those are some of the pillars of intersectionality. Now we talk about DEI, and we know that, prophetically, Dr. Howard states, racial realities are so complex that no one set of experiences can serve as a representative reality for all individuals of a particular group. I think that really sums it all, because it's really difficult to incorporate new facts into your prior knowledge, because what you know to be true may be false. And I think that's difficult. And when that happens, sometimes people will fall into cracks and they will lean into virtual isolation. This is an interesting photo. I'll give people about 30 seconds to digest it before I continue speaking. But this is a really interesting time when we look at, the events of January 6th and June 6th. So I'll give about 15 seconds just to kind of take it in, and then we'll go from there. So on the left, as you see, the shaman, it's a very interesting picture, and I know it got a lot of national attention. And the idea was, citizens do have the right to petition the government, but they do not have the right to enter and break in unlawfully, and also put Congress in a clear and imminent danger. But I guess the challenge is, it was a differentiated response, because when you see the other picture on the right, the George Floyd protests, people have the right to peacefully assemble. But when you see the response was different. And I believe DEI and cultural responsiveness gives us the space to really be able to discuss these differences of opinion or differences in response. If that is the agency of policing, when people of color are targeted differently, we need to have spaces to be able to talk about that so that our responses can be a little bit more unified. I think after seeing some of that, you do have some levels of trauma. And I've really come up with this concept of the trauma triangle, where race is at the top, your social status, and your opportunity gap. So there are definitely some traumatizing moments when you see social status, when you look at the social economic challenges within the country. Race kind of plays into that with opportunities, whether it be educational or employment. So again, looking at the trauma triangle from some of the events, you start to see this is something that society really has to come to grips with. Equity literacy is really important when we look at, although racial identities inform cultural identities, race is not culture, right? The other thing I can say is that the DEI work is not a transactional activity that you can check off. It isn't a one-time event, it's a lifetime process. So again, we know that culture is not a noun, it's actually a verb. It's fluid and it changes over time. So culture is not a thing, or DEI is not a thing, it's actually a verb. It's really kind of a call to action. So when we talk about the pedagogy of oppress, we want to actually pivot towards a pedagogy of hope. And prophetically, Dr. Howard said we need that framework of faith. So if you have hope, you have to remove barriers to belief. And I believe hope is an acronym. I have two actually. The first one is holding on with patient expectations and having an opportunity to produce excellence. So I look at hope in terms of that acronym. Dr. Parham and Dr. Caldwell look at finding ways to reconnect the disconnected triangles to get back to success, because there is definitely a disconnect from homeschool and the community. And, in some cases, the church community. So finding ways to connect it is looking at that pedagogy of hope, because it definitely requires a collaborative problem solving for the issues that we're facing. Here's why the intersectionality of cultural responsiveness and DEI there's a framework, right? Because I have to give you a frame and a name. So this Courageous Conversation framework by Singleton in 2014 gives you 4 really explicit ways to engage in this work. And the first one, stay engaged, experience discomfort, right? We have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Speak the truth, expect and accept non-disclosure. People are going to move at different rates. So just because someone is silent doesn't mean they're not reflecting. So we have to give people, we talked about brave spaces and psychological safety. Amy C. Edmondson writes a book on psychological safety where at some point you're going to move this non-disclosure to where you're more uncomfortable staying silent than speaking up. And Dr. Howard added another leg to this, saying that let data lead the talk, because we know some of the achievement data specifically for kids of color has been really abysmal for decades. But it's really alarming, but we've only expressed it. We really haven't done enough to address it. And the last piece, my colleague, Dr. Grant, and I came up with this DI and dialogue circles where we want people to develop a sense of self-awareness and confidence, but also recognize unfairness and be able to call it out. And we have to describe it, right? We have to name it so that we can really identify the barriers to belief so we can move towards that hope. And also empower people to demonstrate skills to act with others or alone against prejudice and discrimination. So we've all met. This is just my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me beyond this conversation. I'd love to continue to help. And I want to thank you guys for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hill. That was very, very informative. I hope that you all were taking notes and writing down your comments and the questions that you want to place in the chat, or if you want to have an opportunity to speak, you can put that in the chat. We're going to open up the chat now. And thank you all for staying with us, and let's talk. Let's have this conversation. No one has any questions or comments? Okay, so that means our panelists were just above board. They answered everybody's questions, their concerns. There was one question that came in via email. Oh, okay. All right, here we come. So Dr. Stanley Johnson, from UCLA. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for being here. I appreciate you. He has something that he'd like to share, so I'm gonna open your mic. I think I can do that. Hold on.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. I thought I was in trouble because sometimes I can speak too much, so I hadn't even spoken and yet I was muted. But anyway, I just really am very grateful for the panelists. I think collectively all kind of shared not only the accuracy around diversity, equity, and inclusiveness, but the culturally responsive piece is critical. Like many here, I matriculated through the Pasadena Unified School District, so I always had a very soft spot for wanting to make sure that equitable outcomes are indeed in place. And like Dr. Steps shared earlier, it's, to me, I think we have to really be mindful, deliberate and intentional about our particular definitions for how we service students of color in this context. But I think the elephant on the wall that a lot of people are not fully feeling comfortable about is talking about our Black students. We released a report at the Center for the Transformation back in April, which was a second report on explicitly looking at factors that contribute to Black students' overall wellness. And beyond the academic aspects, I really just think that if we don't have a clear understanding of what the difference between equity versus equality, I believe that that's how a lot of the same systems are going to continue to be perpetuated, similar to what Dr. Hines had shared earlier. And I think equity is at its core about fairness. And if we look at what isn't fair, the goal to mitigate that is to put systems in place to begin to control for anything that is unfair. And when you look at a district that's as complex as Pasadena, where the shift in demographics have changed, our students particularly need specific, deliberate, and intentional support in any particular category, especially when we understand the notions that are beset with issues of poverty. So basically, that's a slight tangent. I really am just saying that I was extremely happy and blessed to be able to be a part of this space, seeing that all of the speakers, have a heartfelt sentiment that really is about the positive transformative change that needs to be made on behalf of all kids, but specifically for Black children. We cannot afford to continue to not have an unapologetic approach. It isn't racist. It isn't having a separate agenda. Just looking at what the data is saying, and if it speaks for itself, the goal is to then figure out ways to mitigate, to ensure that all students can have a great access to whatever they decide to do post PUSD. So thank you very much, Board Member Richardson.
Thank you. Okay.
Richard, may I address something if you don't mind, please?
Sure.
Yeah, I was reading the chats, and there's some great conversations happening. One of the conversations that I see is that asking is what we're talking about, DEI, CRT, what Dr. Johnson so eloquently explained just now, is that more or less racism like Plessy versus Ferguson? I just wanted to take a chance to massage that. To me, the work that we're doing is not anything like Plessy versus Ferguson. And let me take a few minutes to really explain this, not just for that person, but for the whole audience. Plessy versus Ferguson was rooted in the idea that white people were superior to Black people, and the superiority was so strong and prevalent to the point that Black people did not really deserve to even be around white people. And then so basically what happened was, if you go back and look at the 14th Amendment of equal protection of the laws, during that time, white people changed equal protection of under the laws to separate but equal. And then the Supreme Court even endorsed that. And Plessy versus Ferguson was a part of the law case that ushered in not only separate but equal, but Jim Crow. The work that we're talking about tonight in no way says that Black people, Hispanic people, Asian people, or Native American people are superior to anybody, especially to white people. The work that we're saying is basically that due to systems of not being allowed to have opportunities because of being Black, brown, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, there has to be some form of fair redress, as Dr. Johnson just indicated, to allow for Black, brown, Asian, and Native American people to have opportunities. Giving opportunities to people of color in no ways is designed to take opportunities away from white people. And the other part of that is, even if that was intent, which it is not, that cannot happen because now I'm 49, I'll be 50 in September, but in my 49 years on this earth, I have never seen any policy, law, or procedure or statute that has been created by a Black people, Hispanic, Asian, or brown people that oppresses white people. So if we're going to have that conversation about, is this racism? Is CRT racism? We have to compare apples to apples and apples to oranges. Again, Plessy versus Ferguson was about separate but equal because of the belief that white people were superior to people of color. The work that we're doing is not separating anyone. In fact, now this is me speaking personally from an opinion perspective, America has always been culturally responsive to white people as a group. That's why the work that we're doing now is ensuring that people of color have some level of cultural responsiveness too. So I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to speak on that. I think this is a forum where we can have honest dialogue, but I did want to make sure I address that question, that is this being racist? And racism is a system of advantage that benefits one group over another group. I have never seen any policy, practice, or procedure that has been designed specifically to benefit people of color over white people. Thank you.
Thank you. Would any more of our panelists like to comment? Okay. PJ Johnson has her hand raised. So I'm going to call on PJ right now.
Thank you so much. The last gentleman, thank you so much for your slides. I wanted to kind of piggyback on Dr. Johnson. I do think that in a world of trying to be culturally sensitive, we have allowed things to go unchecked. And when we do say people of color, we are not really speaking specifically towards African American. We have data that states that there are issues with suspension rate. We don't say that. And when Mr. Hines, you say we're not going to do, oh, and forgive me ahead of time for misquoting you. We're acting like somebody's not going to lose. The only way for equity to truly be done is somebody has to give up something, right? We're acting like that. That's not a real reality. If children are being suspended at the rate of which they are in Pasadena schools, and that the presence of, we are so small amount wise in the schools. Why are we so exorbitantly high in the data? Like, how is that possible? So if we're not directly speaking to that elephant, we cannot have all boats rise. We are definitely having a problem there. And to not say we are going to put out the fire of the house that is most in need right now. We have to say that, because in making sure that the little Black, brown kids who are data-wise are suffering, what happens is white people, Asian people, other people now start to look at those kids as something is wrong with them. I don't want to be them. So we are setting generational problems as we do that, instead of just let's deal with that. And Mr. Johnson, Dr. Johnson, I would love for anybody in the panelists to say, how do we eradicate the systemic way of thinking from teachers who won't have these really difficult conversations and say, I got to sit down and check my own bias and hear what the parents, the community, and the child themselves that I'm dealing with on a daily basis, that they are having this trauma that's constantly hitting them. Every February, when we talk about enslaved people and we do not even give our kids the verbiage of saying enslaved, we go, you came from slavery. They didn't. So like, we set them up like that. And that, as a mother of a 15-year-old, it's trauma. Every time we do Black history and we do white history, the trauma is not coming on and for and to people who are white. It is definitely built in the policy for Black kids, Black people. Thank you so much for allowing me to say something.
Thank you. Would any of our panelists like to respond or comment?
I will comment. Thank you for sharing that. I agree. It just reminds me of the chairman, Fred Hampton. If we live in the community, we know all lives matter, but if my house is burning, I actually need the fire department to come to my house. So I appreciate you saying that with the passion. I agree. I think a lot of it is training and preparation, right? Preparation eliminates fear. So I think on our end, it's really training educators to be able to be intentional and comfortable with discussing those things, but also it's being able to challenge the pedagogy. When you see inaccuracies in the curriculum, you should be able to bring in additional information. Your life didn't start on a slave ship. You should be able to come up with additional information to speak differently about that. But again, it's psychological safety where, oh, am I going to get in trouble because I'm not following the standards? Because, schools go a lot in breadth, but they don't go in depth. So when you just glaze over that and that only takes up a little textbook space, that's where you start to run into those problems. To where, is that a part of enrichment? Where do we debunk some of these myths that have really plagued communities for a really long time? It just reminds me of Carter G. Woodson says that you have to recover from your own education. And I know I'm constantly doing that, checking my own biases, but also being able to speak to some of the inaccuracies so that people aren't misinformed. So I really do appreciate you sharing that passion about right now we do have to have some focused attention around specifically Black children, because they do need the help. But again, we don't want to get into the oppression Olympics and see who's being oppressed the most, because there's no podium. Like I said, with Tommy Smith and John Carlos, you don't get on the podium to see who got oppressed the most. And what that is, that's a way to divide and conquer. And we know how problematic that is. People don't want revenge. They want reconciliation. They want respect. They want reparations. They're not trying to replace people or play in reverse racism, right? We just want to level the playing field so we can play fair so that everybody gets a shot. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I see, I'm gonna call this out. I see Alan Shea, Ann Hickenbottom, and Lawton Gray. I'll take you all in that order. And I'm gonna ask you to unmute Alan. I think it's not working for me. Help, Jeff.
I have asked Alan to unmute. I'm not sure if he's able to.
Okay, it looks like he's unmuted now.
Okay.
Alan? Okay, let's move on. When he's able to come in, we'll let him speak. Ann Hickenbottom says she has a question.
Can you?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. First of all, I really want to commend you, Michelle, for the work you've done putting this panel together. And I really want to thank each one of the panelists who've taken their time to give us this stellar presentation about this important topic. I've learned so very much. And more than food for thought, it's definitely a call to action, and I really very, very much appreciate it. I have a question with respect to language, and I would like, whichever of the speakers would like to comment on it, because language is important. I don't need to tell you all that, but I'm troubled, and one of the previous speakers, I think it was P.J. Johnson's talked about that, the use of a descendant of slave versus a term I prefer to use, enslaved people. And I know it can be provocative to begin to term others not as masters, but as enslavers. I look at other language that we use in real estate today about when we talk about the upward pressures on real estate prices in Pasadena, we call it gentrification. I find that use of a term objectionable to me, as if the people who lived in their neighborhoods, irrespective of their income or their quote unquote class, it implies less than. And I would like to hear any one of our experts to comment on the use of language and how that's a part of what we talk about, both in terms of curriculum, in terms of cultural responsibility, and in terms of empowering our youth and others to the language we use that can look limiting and less than in a very subtle, perhaps even microaggressive way. Thank you for this opportunity. Excellent presentation.
Thank you. Any panelists?
So you wanted to know the importance of language in the work of DEI and cultural responsive teaching. I want to make sure I understand your question, Ms. Hickenbottom, excuse me.
Yes, just broadly, your thoughts about that, and specifically about certain terms about how we talk about the experience of African-American people brought here and how we talk about that. And we use the terms of descendants of slave and what an accomplishment. This person was a descendant of slaves, and despite those barriers they were able to accomplish. And I get that, but I still find it objectionable. I would rather use terms like, I'm not a descendant of a slave. I'm a descendant of a person whose ancestors were enslaved. And we didn't have a master, we had an enslaver. And how does that use of language? Just broadly, whatever your thoughts are, or any of the other panelists in that, when we talk about the history and the language we use in America.
I'll give it a shot. I've developed a training where we spend 90 minutes setting up the language the agreed upon language that we will use. And in my presentation, I was very careful to say enslaved people or formerly enslaved people. So I totally agree with you. I think that the language that we use is a part of the heart work. It's kind of like this, and it's not related to, and I use Black, so if Black or African American, please forgive me if I'm not including you, but it's like this gender pronoun situation that we're all going through. So you'll see some people up here have highlighted their preferred gender pronouns. If we can take the time to learn gender pronouns, we can take the time to unlearn what we've learned as it relates to language and degrading formerly enslaved people, so that we can welcome them and honor them into the spaces. And I feel that that's a part of equity. I feel that that's a part of inclusion. So thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Alan Shea said he is ready to go now.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Alan.
Oh, can you unmute on your end, Alan?
You know, he doesn't look muted. He just faded out.
Yeah.
Can you unmute Dr. Gray for me, please?
Yes, I will do that.
Go ahead, Dr. Gray.
Okay. It's not really a question. It's more of a comment and also a thank you. I know we are now able to have an ethnic studies curriculum, I think, which will be very beneficial to our students. And I know that's from your work, Ms. Bailey, from our Board of Education to Dr. McDonald. But where do you guys see that fits into what we're discussing now in terms of the equity, in terms of diversity, the fact that we are offering this course for students for credit instead of the traditional US history?
You know, I think it really does pivot the pedagogy so that you can really unpack some of the narratives that have existed. That is the opportunity to really get to separate the active teaching from who you are, because it's going to move people in a different direction. It's really designed to nudge your thinking around some of the things that we're told. Why can't we recenter the focus in another way? I think, you know, hearing other voices is important. That's a part of equity too, equity of voice, and the counter narrative. So it really does fit in to the cultural responsiveness, because what that says is that there's a need. The district's listening and what they're hearing matters to really guide that curriculum into that way. I really think it gives students another opportunity to be exposed to more curriculum that some of us had to wait well into college or even past college to find out. So I think earlier is better, but it also gives you an opportunity to establish more creativity and innovation, because now these voices aren't suppressed. It's just like hip hop ed is taking its toll in school. Bringing spoken word, you actually can hit the language standards using spoken word. You can do critical thinking, creativity, connection, collaboration with spoken word. In fact, I've seen some successful schools use that same curriculum and actually talk about critical race discussions and the policing of Black people. So I think I really do have to salute the district for moving in that direction. I think it's going to help. I think, you know, it's definitely a step in the right direction. It's not perfect, it's going to be uncomfortable, but that's a part of continuous improvement where you're able to take this and really unpack some of the things that don't work and revise and resubmit. So I really think that's a great thing.
Great, thank you.
We seem to have fixed Alan Shay's audio problems.
Okay.
So you can go now, Alan. Alan, are you able to unmute your cell phone?
Okay, the questions are piling up in the chat. So Alan, when you can go, just say something. And when we hear your voice, you'll be next if someone is talking. Okay. So let's see. Someone asked, how does this lead to more employment for Black teachers? Does anyone want to answer that?
I can take that. We've been making deliberate attempts to recruit and retain more African-American teachers. And we're primarily doing this through 2 residency programs that we have. One with LA UTR, as well as one with Alder College of Education. The tricky part about that, though, is that we are a district in declining enrollment. And unfortunately, per state law, the last ones in are the first ones to be laid off when we have to reduce or when we have a reduction in force. So we have to continue to find ways to stabilize our enrollment so that we can then stabilize our teaching force. But we also have to have a commitment to making sure that we protect these employees when we do hire them. I think, as many people know, the teaching force is predominantly white females, and it doesn't match the demographics of the district, the student demographics. So this is a significant issue that we're trying to address. But again, some of the systemic issues are really working against us. So we have to be creative. And this is a conversation Dr. Steps and I had today. You know, we're trying to think through what we can do to address this issue that's not a violation of the Ed Code. So we will continue to think this through. We have some very bright people in our district, and I'm sure that we'll be able to come up with something creative over the course of the next few months and years.
Great, thank you, Dr. McDonald. The next question, how do we address many of these same issues with respect to faculty engaged in DEI work, who constantly receive microaggressions and are gaslighted? I don't know.
Can you repeat the question, please, Board Member Bailey?
Yes. How do we address many of these same issues with respect to faculty engaged in DEI work who constantly receive microaggressions and are gaslighted?
I point to the culture shift. I point to embodying DEI from the top down, horizontal, sideways, diagonal. We have to understand that we're moving away from a culture that tolerates microaggression, that tolerates the stereotyping of students. And we don't only stereotype students and microaggress against students verbally. There's environmental microaggressions, right? The way we set up and design a building or a meeting or a dance or a field trip, right? So it's not just for students, but it's also for teachers. And if we understand the tone from the top is that that behavior is no longer tolerated, here are the tools that we've put forward for you to understand how to unlearn those behaviors. That's when it starts to become ingrained into the culture of the agency. And it's not something that's going to happen overnight. When we go to recruitment and retention, and I see Steve Miller on the call. Hey, Dr. Miller. This is something that we're putting in our job bulletins. Pasadena Unified School District fosters an environment of diversity, equity, inclusion. It's a competency that we have on performance appraisals. It's a competency that we're using agency-wide. We're embedding this mindset and the practices into the PUSD community. We're not hiring vendors who don't subscribe to DEI principles. We're making sure that the software and the curriculum and the materials that you provide for us, that there is a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion review so that we can accommodate our students with disabilities. That's my thought. You have to have courageous conversations. You have to first know what microaggressions are, and you have to feel comfortable in addressing them and pulling someone to the side. If you're an ally, you have to understand how you have to stand in the gap for these women, for these people who are a part of the LGBTQ plus community, and how you may have to pull your colleague aside and say, hey, what you said was not okay. Here's why. If you're receiving that feedback, you're coming from a space of thank you for informing me of that behavior. I apologize, and I will intend not to do it again. And we have to get very, very comfortable calling out those behaviors. But that's why it's important to foster DEI on an individual as well as an organizational level.
Great, thank you, Jouslynn. Okay, this next question, Dr. McDonald, I think is for you, but I do see several ELT members on the call, so feel free to chime in if you'd like. Is there a plan to address the student academic deficit from the pandemic, particularly for those students who were not able to get into the credit recovery opportunities for the summer?
I think Dr. Blanco is on the call, so I'll ask her to address it. I think she did in the chat.
Okay, I can't.
Can you hear me?
Hi, everyone. I'm here as,
Can you hear me?
for some reason, I had Dr. McDonald.
Yeah, Alan, you'll be next. I'm sorry, Dr. Blanco. Don't move out.
Okay. So I'm logged in under Dr. McDonald, so he has twins. Now, anyway, I did want everyone to know that we have credit recovery plans to expand our pilot and have in-person support for students that need to make up credits. Our teachers were really tired and we couldn't recruit enough of them over the summer to be able to provide the service to everyone, but we have 5 10-week sessions planned for next year for in-person, as well as our online option that we want to be very selective of who participates in the online option, because we found over time that that was not a successful option for all of our students. They need the connectedness. And I think we will give our teachers a break and they'll be ready to support and serve again after they have that break. But that was the reason we had to focus on 12th graders and then 11th graders. So we're trying to get as many kids as we can over the finish line for summer graduation on August 5th, and then make sure that all of the 11th graders graduate on time for next year. But in the overall scheme of our plan, we want to start addressing credit recovery in 9th and 10th grade.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, Alan, go ahead.
Well, I would really, really like to thank you, Michelle, and Dr. McDonald, because And working closely with both of you for years and years, I am so thrilled to hear a discussion on this crucial issue, which we call in the business industry, how do we get some equity here? And what I'd like to share as a product of Pasadena from K through 12th, John Muir High School graduate, is that the important thing I see, and especially from working as a commissioner in the Northwest for 10 years, is that we have to instill equity values of our community and what that truly means from K through 12th grade. Not once they get to junior high school, it must be a part of their formal training from day one. And the reason I say that is because they'll have a real sense of value, knowing their history, knowing what the community is all about, and certainly making sure their voice is heard as they can become part of the political process. Those type of developments will create a much more stable environment as we move up in life, aging, and we will see the returns. If we don't, our voices will be silent, our position equity will be limited, and we'll be back at the same position 20 years from now. So I would just like to share that with you. I'm very proud of you. I love this. So any way we can help to keep this voice of the PUSD in play, let us know.
All right, thank you, Alan. Okay, I'm checking the time. I have another question here. Are you confident that PUSD, from administration to classroom teachers, are devoted to a change of heart? That is a key factor to affect the change that's needed so every Black student feels valued.
So there comes a time when you do have to do professional development for everyone. I've been, as president, I do have access to California Teachers Association and their professional development in order to make sure we do professional development in social justice and unconscious bias and DEI work. And, you know, our district also works with Pacific Oaks, Dr. Hill, and Dr. Grant. So it's not that individuals want to change. Many don't recognize they need to, but we do need to put forth the training and the professional development consistently to make sure that individuals recognize where their individual biases are, so that we can be fair to all of our students, especially our Black and Brown students. We don't have an option anymore. It's not going to happen overnight. We recognize that. It is going to take some time. It took us years to get to the place where we are now. It's not going to happen overnight, but we do have a commitment from the school board. We do have a commitment when we were working with our DEI committee. We had representatives from each department: human resources, our curriculum, instruction, and professional development, our child welfare and attendance and safety, to look at suspensions, to look at our curriculum. So we're trying to look at things from every direction, but it's not going to happen overnight. And yes, people are going to resist. This is not going to be easy work. So that's just my thought. I don't know if Dr. McDonald or Dr. Blocker has more.
I do have one. We are engaging in a transformation center, and I just have to thank Dr. McDonald and Dr. Blanco, looking at creating an educator profile for any teacher that works in Pasadena, whether it's charter, public school, private, coming up with this profile, but engaging in this transformation work, because diversity is quality, and there's some intentionality around recruiting a diverse teacher workforce. So through this 3-year process, we'll have some continuous coaching, but also some intentionality around how to work on recruiting a diverse workforce, but getting them the proper disposition, because what we need to do in teacher prep is to align it with what works in the district, because we have to move towards the K-12 curriculum so that our teacher prep candidates are ready to step foot in a PUSD school, and they have their, they understand diversity, they understand equity blocking, right? There's certain things that we can put in prep in this transformation center to really make some changes. So I just thought I would mention that. I know that we're going to engage in that work in the fall. And again, Board Member Bailey has been really instrumental in helping us design that partnership.
Okay,
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
yeah, I just wanted to take a little bit of time to address that question, and then I might bird walk a little bit, so forgive me. But we're trying to be very intentional about how we address this issue. Dr. Hill just talked about recruitment and making sure that the people that we're recruiting into the district have a certain mindset, have a certain disposition. So that's an important part of their work. Once we get them into the district, once we recruit them, we have to find a way to retain them as well, you know, as I said earlier. But keep in mind that we've been at this now for many, many years. Back in 2012, we had the critical race conversations that Dr. Hines led. And I think that was a 4 or 5 year effort to try to change the hearts and minds of people and to surface those unconscious biases that sometimes people don't even realize they have. And then, of course, with this latest effort, you know, this is a partnership with the administration of the district, the leadership of UTP, Dr. Steps. We're co-partners in this effort, but we're also engaging with other partners as well, like the classified union and just other stakeholders. And we're trying to be very intentional. This, you know, this is not going to be some program that we come up with. That's all of a sudden it's going to change everything. That's not going to happen. Like Dr. Sepp said, it's not going to happen overnight. This is hard work. The approach that we're taking now is that we're trying to reframe the work so that people understand we want to look at things differently. We want to look at things through the lens of DEI. And one of the more tangible outcomes of our work is a litmus test that we've come up with. And we're applying this litmus test to every decision that we make across the district. And really what we're doing is we're looking at how our actions will disenfranchise our students of color and other groups, or how our work might cause success or lead to success, and so forth. So every decision that we're making, especially at the executive level, we're applying this litmus test so that we're doing the right things, we're making the right decisions for kids. And I want to tell you this, we've reversed several decisions that we would have made had we not used the litmus test. So again, I want to assure you that, you know, I hear the concern, and I want you to know that we are working hard. It's different this time around. The board is leading the charge. I talked about the resolutions. We're partnering with our labor partners. We're partnering with, you know, as many people as possible. And I think we're all coalescing around this need to truly make meaningful and lasting change so that students will benefit from this.
Okay, great. We are running out of time. We have 2 minutes left, and I wanted to try to get 2 more questions in, but I want to respond. I'm looking at the chat. It's a lot going on there. Wanted to respond to those who are asking, you know, what the next steps are. And so I can answer for me as a board member, I want to continue to have these conversations. This started with the event that I had at John Muir, the community conversation, where we talked about from Brown to school closures, how can our students win? It was a wonderful, wonderful panel of educators and community leaders and students. And people just got connected through telling the stories that the panelists shared. And then the audience began to share their stories. I believe the majority of the audience went through PUSD prior to integration. So, you know, I as a board member, I want to continue to have these conversations. The community knows that, you know, this is where I'm pushing for PUSD, the direction for PUSD to go in. We need to be focused on the success of our students. The majority of the students in PUSD are students of color, and yet they come to school, several of them come to school every day not feeling valued, and that impedes their success. So I'm happy that we're having this conversation. I'm happy that the community is interested in having this conversation. And at the last community conversation, I challenged the community, those of you who work outside of the school system, in your respective workplaces and in your respective communities, to promote cultural responsiveness. You know, that was a deep conversation. So tonight, with the closing poll, I believe the question is going to be, how have you promoted it, or how will you promote it? Please take the time to respond to the poll. The other thing that I want to do is I want to put in the chat, there were several questions at the end of the last event. And I went to, and I want to thank Dr. Blanco and Helen Hill for assisting me with this information, but they have given me 2 links that responded not in totality, but partially to one of the questions. The question was, what does culturally responsive look like in PUSD? And so one of the documents that they gave me a link to is the 2020-2021 Equity Diagnostic by Hanover Research. And it's a somewhat of a SWOT analysis of the district. So I'm going to put that in the link so that you all can see that. And also there is a portrait of a culturally responsive school document that highlights the professional development that PUSD staff and a couple of us board members had the privilege to participate in, that was facilitated by the Leadership Academy, sponsored by LACO, the Los Angeles County Office of Education. And so I will also put that link in the chat as well. And so if you have an opportunity, go in and take a look at these documents. They can share, you can learn from the documents the work that PUSD is planning to continue to this end. I'm committed to it. I appreciate the board who has actually embraced this as well. So we have board support. I thank Dr. McDonald for taking those resolutions and using them as a framework to promote a more cultural responsive modality throughout the district. And I appreciate Allison and all of the employees who have partnered with her as well to begin to have the conversations about DEI and how to bring that together within PUSD. But I also agree with Jouslynn. We have to go outside of PUSD. We have to have those partnerships. We have to partner with our community. We have to bring the community on board. These types of conversations and these types of presentations are in an effort to inform the community so that they understand what this looks like. What I realized was happening was that when I talked to educators, DEI and culturally responsiveness seemed to be understood when I'd have those conversations. But outside of the education community, I would hear DEI, but no one hardly knew what cultural responsiveness was, and they didn't understand the connection. So that was why that's why this happened tonight with this focus. And so I thank you all for being here, and I'm sorry I'm going to have to end it, but before I do, I want to ask the last question, because I was actually working to get a little clarity around asking it. Okay, so the links are there, but the last question, and it's to, she said any panelists, but I think it's trying to get to the matter of smaller class sizes, and it has to do with the budgets. So please talk about PUSD budgets, how funds remain at the top or to purchase programs, yet never go to teachers of color or smaller class sizes. And so I know that we had conversation about that briefly. So Dr. McDonald, I don't know if you want to chime in or if you want to ask one of the other ELT members to chime in for us.
You know, that's a topic that will take some time for me to address. I would encourage whomever it is that asked that question to come to the board meetings in June, when our CBO will be presenting the budget to the board. I will say that, you know, notwithstanding the fact that we've received quite a bit of funding from the federal government, we have to think about whatever decision we make, we have to think about sustainability. So to lower class size means that we would have to hire more teachers. And that's just simply not something that we can do. You know, it's, you know, typically 80 to 85% of any school district's budget consists of people. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that we are a declining enrollment district, and we can't continue to add positions, you know, knowing that we're gonna have to turn right back around and lay people off. So, you know, this is a conversation that would take some time. And I would welcome a one-on-one conversation with the person that asked the question. And again, I would encourage that person to attend the June board meetings. I think it's on the 24th that the CBO will present the budget. And we can have some more conversation around that in a public setting.
Thank you, Dr. McDonald. Okay, so I also want to thank our co-sponsors of tonight's events, Collaborate Pasadena and Jeff Albert, our virtual hosts, Pacific Oaks College, my new family, my new education family in Pasadena, and the Pasadena Unified School District. I would also like to acknowledge our panelists, Jouslynn Griffin, Dr. Allison Steps, Dr. Mack Hines, and Dr. Brian McDonald, and of course, our keynote, Dr. Jerell Hill, for their time and commitment to this moment. I'd like to thank Assistant Superintendent Helen Hill again, and Chief Academic Officer, Dr. Elizabeth Blanco, for their continued support, ensuring that I have accurate data and up-to-date information to provide to these events as I host them. And finally, I would like to thank all of you, our special guests, for your support of public education, and to commend you for engaging in opportunities to participate in the hard conversations that involve race and the need for societal transformation. Don't forget to take a moment to complete the poll, the exit poll, before you leave the Zoom platform completely. Stay safe and have a nice weekend. Thank you.